Welcome to B-Movie Enema, the series. I'm Jeff Arbuckle. With me, as always, is Nurse Disembody. We've got ourselves a heck of a treat for this week's episode. We're going to watch the Oblong Box. Now, this comes from a short story by one of the greatest poets and writers of the American 19th century, Edgar Allan Poe. Nurse, what do you know about the Poe-meister?
Let me think. Spooky things. Quoth the raven, nevermore. And there's a whole bunch of movies made about his short stories and poems.
Yeah, and...
Oh, there's the Telltale Heart story, too.
Oh yeah, that's the one about the guy who murders someone and buries him under the floorboard only to be haunted by the beating of his heart. Yeah, spooky stuff indeed. Poe's a particularly interesting writer when it comes to the pantheon of American writers. For one, his stuff is fairly morbid. He lived from 1809 to 1849, and what he wrote might actually come down to something closer to outright horror during that time frame. Poe was relatively unsuccessful for much of his early life. When he was 18, he couldn't support himself, so he joined the United States Army, and while in the Army, he published a book of poems that got pretty much no attention. When he turned 26, he married his cousin Virginia Clem, who was only 13 at the time.
Yikes.
Yeah, probably not all that uncommon back then. Anyway, she only lived to 24, and it's said that her illness and death probably influenced a lot of his writing. That certainly would explain why he wrote a lot about death and mourning, and what happens to the body after death, being buried alive, and reanimation. And he was really a master of gothic horror.
It says here he invented the detective fiction genre.
Yeah, that was news to me, too. Apparently, he also wrote a lot of comedies, too. He often liked to write with irony and poke fun at extravagance. He was also quite influential in reinventing science fiction, and he was generally fascinated by the technological advancements of that era. But almost everyone knows Poe best for horror and other general spooky stories. It's kind of funny, Nurse. There's an American artist named Edward Gorey who was known for these kind of macabre, or at least very gothic images. If anyone watched the PBS show Mystery, then you have seen his work. But anyway, when I think of Edgar Allan Poe, I think of it in the style of Gorey.
There are so many movies made from Poe's stuff.
Yeah, definitely. There are two main periods in which I think Poe's stuff became really hot for adaptation. The first period was during the golden age of horror, or at least that's what I call it, and that's the Universal era. In fact, they did 3 Poe movies from 1932 to 1935, and all 3 featured Bela Lugosi: Murders in the Rue Morgue, The Black Cat, and The Raven. The last 2 had Lugosi going right up against Universal's other superstar of the time, Boris Karloff. Lugosi's great in The Black Cat and The Raven, and to have him share the screen with Karloff during the very height of their careers is some really good stuff. Now, in 1934, both The Black Cat and the independent exploitation film Maniac, also known as Sex Maniac, were loose adaptations of Poe's original story of The Black Cat. Now, Maniac also featured elements of Murders in the Rue Morgue. What's really interesting about Maniac is that, one, there's a scene pulled directly from Poe's The Black Cat about taking the eye out of a cat. Now, they actually used a cat that had only one eye and did pretty nifty little effect as if the character was really pulling the eye out, but the cat remained completely unharmed and was well cared for. Secondly, Maniac was pre-code, which means that not only is there a fairly explicit rape scene, but the movie also featured nudity. The second period in which a ton of Poe stuff was adapted was in the 60s, and this was largely due to successful films made by Roger Corman. House of Usher, The Pit and the Pendulum, The Premature Burial, Tales of Terror, The Raven, The Mask of the Red Death, and The Tomb of Ligeia were all done by Corman in consecutive years. However, there were a lot more, like the British films based on The Telltale Heart, as well as The Conquering Worm, which was renamed to Witchfinder General. The Italian production of Castle of Blood, and the West German film The Blood Demon were all coming out at the same time, all based on Poe's stuff. There were tons of short films and cartoons that were also made based on Poe's writing. Perhaps the most famous would be found in the very first Treehouse of Horror episode from The Simpsons, which had a straight adaptation of The Raven as read by James Earl Jones and featured Homer as the narrator and Bart as the titular Raven. But here we are in 1969 with The Oblong Box.
Starring Vincent Price.
Yes, and we will talk about Price in the next segment, but this was directed by Gordon Hessler. Hessler was born in Berlin, and he was hired by American International Pictures to make a trio of horror films all starring Vincent Price. The Oblong Box was first, and then the second would be Scream and Scream Again, co-starring Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing, and the third film was Cry of the Banshee. Originally, Price would have gone on to make Hessler's next film, Murders in the Rue Morgue, but Price and AIP didn't exactly see eye to eye, and he was out to be replaced by Jason Robards. Most of the 70s and 80s was spent directing episodes of popular TV shows for Hessler. He retired after making a few more movies in the late 80s and early 90s, and passed away in London in 2014 at the ripe old age of 88. Nurse, are you ready to peek inside the Oblong Box?
Yes.
Alright, so let's get things started with this lovely little thriller, and we'll be back after the first act of the movie.
Vincent Price is just a classic spookster. The way he talks, the accent he has, it's just so iconic and something only he has.
Yeah, so Vincent Price was born in St. Louis in 1911. He would go on to attend Yale and work on the school's humor mag, the Yale Record. By the late 30s, he started appearing in films as a character actor. However, it would be horror where he would end up making his biggest mark. He got hooked up with Universal, first in 1939's The Tower of London with Boris Karloff. A year later, he would play Sir Geoffrey Radcliffe in The Invisible Man Returns. And man, talk about a perfect role. One of the great things about the original Invisible Man was that it starred Claude Rains, another actor with a very distinct voice. So to spot that Price would be perfect for the sequel because of his voice, well, that's some really good casting. Now, while Price would go on to do lots of different types of roles, horror would be what he's, of course, best known for. He was never one to look down on the roles in horror. He actually liked doing horror because people would grow up watching his movies and they'd remain fans of his as they got older. It was a great way to retain those fans of his.
There's all sorts of really interesting information about Vincent Price. He had lots of really good ideals.
Yes, he did, but it took a little bit of time for him to get there. Interestingly, when Price was a young man, and this would have been probably in the earlier part of the 30s, he visited Germany and Austria right as Hitler was gaining more and more and more power. He actually did adopt some anti-Semitic ideology and even admired Hitler. It was mostly due to the same way a lot of other people did, by getting swept up in this kind of new attitude that Germany was going through.
Yikes.
But shortly after returning to the States and moving to New York City, he began befriending liberal writers such as Dorothy Parker and Lillian Hellman. He shifted so far left, in fact, he ended up getting gray-listed under McCarthyism in the 50s.
Oh my god, he was shadow banned.
Pretty much. But get this, he was labeled a pre-war, premature anti-Nazi. Now, all this talk of Antifa and what have you nowadays, that is just another name for quote-unquote premature anti-Nazi. So I guess if you're a little too against fascism, you're pretty un-American or some such stupid shit.
I hate this world sometimes.
You and me both. But anyway, after signing some secret oath with the FBI, Price was able to get back to work again, and he was so well liked by pretty much everyone. Price was appointed to the Indian Arts and Craft Board under the Eisenhower administration. That's pretty crazy that at one point in time, a Republican president would appoint a registered Democrat to a position. But anyhow, Price would go on to be at the forefront of a ton of socially aware causes. In 1950, he monologued to a radio audience of the dangers of prejudice and how that and racism could only really fuel support for the enemies of this country. His daughter came out as a lesbian, and he rallied against anti-gay rights campaigns of the 70s. He also was incredibly vocal, one of the very earliest celebrities to do so, in fact, about how we need to not be scared of the HIV/AIDS epidemic and how people who suffered from the disease needed help and compassion.
Is it true that he was also bisexual?
It's quite possible. His daughter Victoria said that when she came out, he confided in her about intimate relationships he had with men. Now, I do not believe for a single moment that Victoria was being untruthful about a personal conversation she had with her father. Whether or not he was gay, bi, or straight, it really doesn't matter what he would be classified as. It's clear that Price was super understanding of people from all backgrounds.
I always loved the poem he read during Thriller. It's just perfect with what the song was and the video with the werewolves and zombies and everything. His voice is perfect.
Yeah, some of my earliest memories were of those songs from the Thriller album and that video in particular. The 80s were a really good time for Price. From 81 to 89, he hosted Mystery on PBS. Remember I mentioned that earlier with the Edward Gorey imagery used in the opening and how I always think of that style when I think of Edgar Allan Poe. But anyway, this movie gets started pretty quick, doesn't it, Nurse?
No kidding. No slow burn going into this movie. They crucified that jerk right away.
Yeah, we get right into the story. Price's Julian Markham and his brother Sir Edward had some dealings in Africa and, well, it didn't really go so well, did it?
No, I guess it really didn't, huh?
So they get back to at the Markhams by putting a curse on Sir Edward. They would have, I guess, put one on Julian too, but I guess he was not around. I think he might have been off in the jungle taking a leak or something. But anyway, they have to keep Sir Edward locked up.
Then he believes Sir Edward dies, and to prevent the others around town from seeing what happened to him, they have to go get a different body.
Yeah, there's a guy who hangs out with the family Trench, and he doesn't seem all that trustworthy, does he? He's the Markham's lawyer, but man, there's a fantastic line delivered by Price in this first act directed at Trench when he needs Trench to find a body to replace Sir Edward. Julian approaches Trench after revealing that he knows Trench has been skimming off the top of the family by forging withdrawal papers to take money out of the bank and says, "You're a forger and an embezzler, and now you're going to become a body snatcher." That's just fantastic. And what I found out later is that Peter Arne, who plays Trench, is an embezzler in real life. Arne and his partner, Jack Cork, befriended English novelist Mary Renault and her partner, Julie Muller. Now, they met on a steamer that was headed to South Africa from England. Arne and Cork convinced Renault that they could get rich quick by building housing for immigrants. And Renault basically fronted them £25,000, but Arne and Cork basically pissed the money away on high living and didn't pay the craftsmen they hired to build the houses. They then stole her car and took off for a bit, and that's when she decided to cut them out of her life. She never saw them again after they moved out, and Arne returned to England, where he would eventually start acting. And of course, this was all before Vincent Price ever stated to him that he was a forger and an embezzler.
Art truly imitates life. We should probably get back to the movie.
Agreed. So let's find out what the various conspirators are going to do to get Sir Edward Markham out of his temporary tomb within his oblong box. Okay, so the oblong box gets intercepted and ends up in the hands of one Dr. Newhart, played by the always amazing Christopher Lee.
I barely recognized him with his long hair and wizard cloak.
Newhart has these guys who go and rob graves for him. Now, Newhart does experiments and stuff on the corpses, but I guess he just can't seem to obtain these bodies legally.
Hey man, you gotta do what you gotta do.
Fair enough. Now, one thing I like about this movie is that it's kind of full of unsavory people. The Markhams kind of took advantage of the African tribes, and Julian laments that they mistreated them with their dealings. That's what ultimately led to that opening scene with the tribe getting back at Sir Edward. So the Markhams are not exactly innocent, and it sure seems like Sir Edward is particularly angry and guilty. Meanwhile, you have their lawyer, Trench, who seems slimy as hell. Newhart wants to cut up bodies for reasons. He pays people to rob those graves.
Let's not let Julian Markham off the hook entirely. He needed to mislead people about his brother, so he pays Trench to go get a body.
Oh, he's definitely being deceptive. He is innocent to the extent that he didn't count on Trench and Trench's little buddy Norton to go kill a guy to get that body.
Fair, but he's still not totally on the up and up.
Well, that's true, but at least Julian does end up confessing to his girlfriend Elizabeth about everything that happened in Africa and how he and Sir Edward are basically busted and just have a house and the title, and that's about it. But anyway, Christopher Lee. We haven't really talked about him before on the show, and what more could I really add? The guy spent about 70 years in the business. He was Dracula many times over. He was basically the Karloff for Hammer films, having also played the Mummy and Frankenstein's monster. Later in his career, he was in Gremlins 2 as a mad scientist working for Daniel Clamp. He was, of course, Count Dooku in 2 of the 3 Star Wars prequels. He was Saruman in the Lord of the Rings movies. The guy's been in a ton of stuff. In 1974, he appeared as Scaramanga in the James Bond movie The Man with the Golden Gun. That was Roger Moore's second outing as 007 and came out only a year after his first film in the role, Live and Let Die. Scaramanga is one of those villains that I think kind of deserved better than the movie that he got. I find The Man with the Golden Gun to be pretty not great, but Lee is great.
Well, no duh, it's Christopher Lee. When is he not great?
Very true, Nurse, but Christopher Lee was a step-cousin to Bond creator Ian Fleming. Reportedly, Fleming offered Lee the role as the titular villain in 1962's Dr. No. Lee was all about taking that role. However, by the time word got to the producers that Lee accepted the part, Eon Production had already basically cast Joseph Wiseman. Much like his step-cousin, Lee also served in intelligence during the Second World War, and I'm not too sure I would have wanted to run into Christopher Lee if I was an enemy of Great Britain.
Ooh, definitely not. You don't know if he's going to bite you, throw you, crush you, or just stab you.
Yeah, no kidding. Lee desperately tried to avoid horror during the 70s, where Vincent Price was all too happy to appear in both darker and lighter tone horror. Lee specifically wanted to avoid typecasting. He wasn't totally free from horror, but once he appeared in his final Dracula film for Hammer, he didn't want to be a monster anymore. However, there are 2 roles that he turned down that he later regretted. One was as Dr. Loomis in Halloween, and the other is Dr. Rumek in Airplane. Of course, Donald Pleasance took the first role, and Leslie Nielsen took the second. I think Christopher Lee would have been great in both roles. So, Sir Edward is out and about, and he even got himself a little girlfriend, Sally.
You know, at first I thought the movie was trying to pass off that red sock mask thing as spooky or creepy, but then Sally thought it was hot, so I guess it's not that spooky, huh?
Yeah, I do admit to a little bit of confusion here. I get that Newhart is none too pleased about Edward blackmailing him in order to have a place to stay and some clothes and what have you. I like that he wants to strike back at Edward once he realizes that Sally's sweet to him, so he sends Sally away.
Yeah, don't worry too much about her. She'll just get a job a couple doors down at the old Markham house.
Yeah, true. But anyway, Edward could have killed Newhart or ratted him out as a grave robber or something. Instead, what's he do?
What everyone would do when their maid girlfriend gets sent away by the man of the house? Go to the brothel.
Yeah, even when you're trying to keep a low profile?
Especially when you're trying to keep a low profile.
I guess, but all the ladies really seem to like his masks, don't they?
Boy, do they.
Well, anyway, he's killed a prostitute now, and now Sir Edward is a bit of a problem. So let's get to the thrilling conclusion of the Oblong Box. And with that, the curse has been passed from Edward Markham to Julian.
Is it like a werewolf curse? It gets passed by way of saliva or something?
I don't know.
Is Julian going to go crazy now too?
You got me.
Okay.
Now, there are a couple of people I do want to call out here in the cast. The first is Hilary Dwyer, who played Julian's betrothed Elizabeth. Now, Dwyer mostly worked in TV, but she did appear in Witchfinder General and Cry of the Banshee alongside Vincent Price. She stopped acting in 1976 after appearing in an episode of Space 1999, but she would go into behavioral therapy later in life and eventually became an addiction counselor. Sadly, she passed away in March of 2020 in the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic. Because of the early lockdowns, her wishes for a large funeral were not granted. Her burial was only attended by her daughter and the presiding vicar. Her son couldn't even attend due to travel restrictions since he is based in Los Angeles. And then lastly, there's Rupert Davies, a longtime character actor. He plays a sort of pivotal role in this movie as a local artist who discovers the discarded body that was used to stand in for Sir Edward in the fake funeral. His sketching of that dead man was spotted by Julian, which leads to Trench needing to expose the truth about Sir Edward not actually being dead. Davies appeared in a lot of high-profile movies like Dracula Has Risen from the Grave and, again, Witchfinder General. He appeared in the War and Peace series produced by the BBC with a young Anthony Hopkins. Much like Hilary Dwyer, he did a bunch of TV work, but certainly had a recognizable face. Alright, Nurse, let's start bringing this one in for a landing. Give us those final words on the Oblong Box.
Alright, here we go. The Oblong Box has a lot of good stuff in it. It has the fast start with Edward being crucified and cursed, and Vincent Price is so cool in this movie. He's got such an interesting voice and that neat way of speaking that makes him sound like he has some sort of British accent, but he's really just from the Midwest United States. And it's always cool to have Christopher Lee around too. That's definitely a plus here. But there are some issues here. First, I would like a little more pizzazz with Sir Edward's red mask. I get what they're trying to do to hide his face, but I would have liked a little bit more of a creep factor with that mask. And I expected to see something truly horrific under that thing, but just no. It was just a normal, ugly face. Nothing too exciting there. They should have given him some more boils, some pustules, scars. I mean, pop an eyeball out, something. But having Edward go into the brothel when he was just trying to remain a little more low profile, it was also confusing too, but hey, at least he was getting some action from the ladies. Anyway, there's just enough here to like in order for me to award the Oblong Box 3.5 poops out of 5. It would have gotten a 4 if not for the kind of regular, not so scary face that Sir Edward was hiding under the hood. But back to you, Jeff.
Alright, well, thank you, Nurse. I did kind of mention already that it seems that Julian was lamenting how he and Edward kind of exploited the Africans, and that was not originally part of the story. That was actually added by director Gordon Hessler. The story behind that was the original script for this movie would have had Edward and Julian be twins, and both were to be played by Price. The movie would have also been directed by Witchfinder General's Michael Reeves, but Reeves got sick during pre-production. Hessler then came in and split the roles that would have originally had Price playing both brothers. They brought in Alistair Williamson to play Edward, but he had never been on screen this much before. In fact, he had more screen time than both Price and Lee. But his voice was dubbed by another actor and his face was mostly hidden. The biggest change was the addition of the pro-Africa anti-imperialism angle that Hessler wanted to include with script doctor Christopher Wicking. They definitely wanted the more sympathetic story as to what would lead to such retribution toward the Markham family. This new piece to the story led the film to be banned in Texas.
Because of course.
Of course. So, alright, so Nurse.
What's up, Doc?
Only one last episode left to the season.
I know, it went by so fast.
I sure did. Now, if you don't mind here, I'm going to go out and find myself a party full of drunken hooligans and some dancing prostitutes.